Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Slavery Archive Book Club. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor at Howard University, historian, and we are here today for the book club to celebrate the new book by Chelsea Stieber. My co-hosts are Okay.
Here.
I know. I forgot. Sorry, I forgot to turn off Chrome. Then now we have our co-hosts who are Alex Hill from Columbia University, Jessica Marie Johnson, who is assistant professor at then Johns Hopkins, and Vanessa Holden, that should be around, but I can find her. Then if she can spotlight herself to all of you. Then just to remind you that for those of you on YouTube, you can post your questions in the chat. You'll be taking the questions there. We are going to have an introduction by Alex. Then Chelsea is going to speak about the book. And after that, everybody will be able to ask questions. Then we are here today for H's paper, War and Post-Independence Writing, Civil War, and the Making of the Republic, 1804-1954. And this book was published last year by New York University Press. Have a good session.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everybody. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Chelsea Stieber, scholar that I already know for several years. And let me tell you a little bit about her for those of you who come at this from different disciplines. Chelsea Stieber is Associate Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Catholic University of America. She's the author of Haiti's paper, War, which we're here to discuss today, and the co-editor of the critical translation of Louis-Joseph Janvier's Haiti for the Haitians, under contract with Liverpool University Press, so look out for that one. She is currently working on a new project on Caribbean fascism, for which she was awarded an ACLS fellowship for the academic year 2020-2021, and my question will be related to that later on. She already knows. So without further ado, let's pass the mic to Chelsea for her to tell us a little bit about this great book, this fascinating book that we just read. For those of you, before I pass it on to Chelsea, that's for those of you who didn't get a chance to read the book, this is an opportunity for you to learn about the great book. Chelsea's going to be telling us a little bit about what the book is about. So there's a little something for you too also. And then after Chelsea is done, then we're going to take questions. We usually take questions here on Zoom and on YouTube. So the way we take questions on Zoom is that we ask you to please raise your hand, but you can start formulating those questions already. You can start typing them on the chat as we go along, and then we'll call you after Chelsea is done.
Oscar,
to get our conversation started. Yes. Oh, did somebody has their mic on? In any case, we also take questions on YouTube. So if you have a question on YouTube, ask it there, and we'll one of us will actually bring the question here and we'll ask it to Chelsea. So with that, I pass it to Chelsea. Take it away, Chelsea.
all right. Thank you so much, Ana Lucia. Thank you, Alex. Actually, I just have a bunch of thank yous that I want to go through, but it really is, it might sound hackneyed, but I'm honored to be in such esteemed company. So thank you to the Slavery Archive Book Club co-organizers, Ana Lucia, truly unparalleled, indefatigable, Alex Hill, Jessica Marie Johnson, and Vanessa Holden. Also all the other authors who've done such incredible work and who've generously been in conversation here. And everyone else, I sneaked a peek at the people who are in the room, and I am really grateful for you taking the time to come, and anyone who watches on YouTube as well, obviously. Pages 261 to 263 of my book also have thank yous. My colleagues at CUA, Haitianists, everyone. And I mentioned to Ana Lucia earlier, an early portion of this book I was able to present at Howard at the Slavery, Memory, and African Diaspora seminar that Ana Lucia runs. And so I want to just thank her again and thank all the people at Howard for their generous and transformative feedback. So yeah, what I wanted to, I will tell you about the book, but I do want to also kind of do the origin story as well, which maybe for me seemed a bit self-indulgent, but I think it's important to sort of situate where I'm coming from, because as Alex sort of intimated, the book club does skew toward the properly historical, though not exclusively. So I think it's sort of necessary for me to explain a bit where I'm coming from methodologically and disciplinarily. So this book came out of a joint French and Francophone language, thought, culture, literature, basically, but more than that, program mixed with an interdisciplinary history sociology institute, the Institute of French Studies. And I think it's safe to say, though it's changing, that way back in the day when I was starting this program, it wasn't so obvious where Haiti fit in that space. There are just problematic conceptions of really chronology in the canon. What is Francophone literature and when does it begin? And Haitian literature begins long before sort of the broader conceptions of what Francophone literature had been at that point. But also, you know, some of the more thorny discussions of French universalism and French culture and the sort of limits of French universalism really at that point weren't taking into consideration or enough into consideration France's colonial history. All of that to say, for me, sort of getting to this project was about getting to Haiti and how I understood what Haiti was and what Haiti did sort of in these spaces. It became so essential for me to sort of push back against some of these artificial limits and chronologies. So I began sort of thinking with Haiti, and that, you know, my mind was blown, and then I picked up the pieces and started on the path toward my dissertation and my book. But so the project itself, to talk about that, was based also on a realization or an understanding of the internal divisions, regionalism, Civil War, the meanings of independence, of liberté, of 1804 and 1806, from, I would call it a Michel Wolfe-Trouillot-esque experience, which is to say I visited the citadel in the north of Haiti, and that didn't track with sort of what I'd thought I was going to get and the conversations that I had around that. But I think it also came more broadly about work that I was doing, sort of understanding the deeply regional and deeply sort of contested meanings of Haiti's past that I found in different regional discourses, but also sort of on the ground, and wanting to make sense of that and sort of pushing against this capital-centric idea that Haiti sort of is just Port-au-Prince and vice versa. And so I also build so much on some of the people who have done work, especially on the ways that Haiti has been narrated, raced, silenced, but also very loudly and violently defamed, and the way that Haiti has been used. And that is, of course, the work of Michel Wolfe-Trouillot, who I mentioned, Enoch Trouillot, Michael Dash, and Marlena Doubt. So on these scholars, I wanted to sort of focus more specifically, you know, thinking with their work and thinking with the work that they've done, wanting to focus specifically on how these external forces of civilizing, narrating, silencing, violent defamation were also negotiated internally within Haiti, that these were the fraught, contested internal processes of the making of Haiti that I ended up deciding to turn into this very long study in my book. So methodologically speaking, it's through a close reading of texts, fiction, nonfiction, but with a focus on these internal realities, tensions, pluralities that shaped the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. And in particular, I'm looking at these narrative constructions and discursive makings that are at work in this contestation, mutual definition, and continual reinscription of Haiti's meaning throughout its long 19th century and well into the 20th. Yes, so that is what sort of was at the origin point of this book and where and how I got to it. There are lots of other sort of anecdotes and stories that I'll be sure to try and weave in if I can talk about it in the questions, but those are sort of the points that I think about as sort of essential to understanding. And what resulted, I hope, is this book that does render Haiti's 19th century more complex, more regionally diverse, less monolithic, and less of an idea. And hopefully with some concision, though it did end up being quite long. Just to end, because I'm really just so grateful that people are here, and I the opportunity to talk about my book and be in conversation is so one that I'm so grateful for. But I did want to sort of just end by situating our discussion tonight, or even framing it in what's going on in Haiti today. Because this is a platform, and I want to sort of use it to highlight that, but also because so much of what people are talking about on the ground and so much about what's happening, people are framing through these sort of foundational moments, 1791, 1804, 1806. And the idea that these past moments are so interconnected with the present, and especially the US's role in the crisis. So I think I actually had put together a list of just some great links to different writing that people on the ground are doing. And so I'll put that in the chat, and then maybe if other people who have other ideas could put those in the chat too, that would be great too. So we could share those, just, you know, contemporary current writings on what's going on in Haiti. So that's all I have. Again, thank you all so much for being here, for reading, and I really look forward to getting to talk to you.
I thank you, Chelsea, so much. It is our honor. But what if I asked you for first of all, if you for those of you, because our club actually invites a combination of both. It's heavy on the historians, right? But it also combines many disciplines, but also brings in people from different walks of life, even students. And sometimes people come here to get a sense of an author, even before they've had a chance to encounter it. What if I asked you to tell us in broad strokes for somebody who is completely new to all of this, and who hasn't had a chance for any reason to read your book, what would you tell that person in broad strokes is the paper wars about? I mean, I know what they're about because I read the book. But can you give us at least that, just to give an anchor to some of the people who are just coming in?
Thank you for that question and for sort of reframing a bit how I'm presenting it. It is about, and I mean, again, I think I got at that a bit in my introduction. It's about the contested meaning of Haiti internally. I mean, again, I'm framing it, and I think this is necessary. This has been such an essential reframing to the way that we think about Haiti within a broader Atlantic context, right? How the US has both silenced and denigrated Haiti, how what France's relationship to Haiti is. But what I'm focusing on is understanding how Haiti, the meaning of Haiti, and how Haiti's sort of post-revolutionary existence was also super fraught. And the paper wars are about that fighting internally. There are moments where there's actually, like, on the ground, you can trace the volleys back and forth of pamphlets, but there's also this larger sort of heritage of writing about what Haiti means that just continually gets rescripted, but continues to call back to some of these original fractures, but really they're just these original contested meanings of what Haiti is, what the Haitian Revolution is, what 1804 is, what 1806 is. So that is what the paper wars is. And again, I trace it from 1804 through to the 20th century, but there's an argument that it could go back to 1791 too. That was not in the cards for me, but yeah.
Thank you very much. So everybody, please start formulating your questions. Those of you who already have them, raise your hand and we will call on you. I see a lot of friendly faces in the participants list. I'm going to get us started with a question that I already warned Chelsea about. And that is something that I noticed from, I mean, the book is very ambitious. It goes from what Chelsea calls 1804 /1806, which I think is very smart to call it that, up until mid 20th century, tracing a genealogy through at least two lines of political persuasion. But the interesting part to me, and this is where her last chapter ends with this kind of like lead-in that I imagine leads into that work that is coming, the work on fascism in the Caribbean, which is this idea that Maurasianism or Maurras, this kind of fascist integral nationalism, it's becoming part of the discourse in the Caribbean directly in the 20th century. But it comes in as now within the frame of what we call the left and the right. But where Chelsea begins us in the book is not anything that we can call the left or the right. So somehow we end up in this kind of leftist and right-wing politics, but we start from a place of anti-colonialism and critique of liberalism versus a kind of republicanism that is worried about respectability in an international sphere. So I want to know, Chelsea, if you've thought about like whether is it possible to even rescue a kind of political discourse that doesn't end where we are too comfortable in, which is this kind of, there's the left wing and then there's the right wing, and right wing is bad. And if Caribbean people do right wing, they should probably stop, right? But we know that in the Caribbean, that whatever we could call that right wing is actually maybe serving a really good purpose. When you have colonizers on your back, maybe you want to have a little bit of blood and soil in there, no? So, I don't know. How do we get out of this bind? Is left and right there where we want to end up in, or should we go back to that original, dichotomy that you break in the first paper wars? All right.
Yeah, that you put it really well. Those are all open questions, and won't throw it back to you. I will answer it, but I will throw it back to the existence of your coming book, and that will indeed be something that will be wrestled with, and that I'm so and I am absolutely going to be going back to Césaire for the Caribbean Fascism Project. I mean, he's central, right, to the Caribbean Fascism Project. I have him in mind in particular. Alex is working on a book on translation of a thought to be lost play from Césaire. But so I want to think about it in two ways. I mean, you posed the question really well. I want to I'll lay the groundwork for the Caribbean Fascism Project, even though this is about my current book, because it's all part of the same thing. But then I also want to maybe even think about what I've thought about what I would have done differently. And, not to say that I think that what's there is incorrect. It's absolutely what I meant to say. But anyway, so the Caribbean Fascism Project, I don't think what I wrote about in the 1930s, 20s and 30s in Haiti is fascism properly. There are French theory, and that also gets into these inane conversations that people have in, newspapers and on Twitter about like, is it fascism or not? And they're so worthless as conversations. I hope people are catching on to that, which is to say, we can name something or we cannot, but it's much more interesting to think about what the ideology is that's at work, but also where it's coming from and where it's heading. And I say that because the Caribbean fascism that I'm trying to sort of conceptualize is Caribbean because sort of settler colonialism and white supremacy is Caribbean. And sort of so many of these ideologies that become central to what we would call fascism, in a very narrow early 20th century European sense, are Caribbean, right? They're born in the Caribbean to a degree, or at least in part. But then also looking at the ways that I would call, for example, Duvalierism, fascism. And I'm alongside a bunch of other Caribbean scholars and Haitian scholars in particular who would. But so that period that you're talking about, Alex, that I end the final chapter with, it's relating to, and I announced this in the introduction, it's relating to my discussion of Dessalines, and it's related to my discussion of what it means to do a properly, like a critique of the Enlightenment, and what it means to be even anti-liberal, like anti-liberal in the sense that like liberalism is bad for us. Liberalism as it's conceived as an ideology or, a system of the Enlightenment, especially in the early 19th century, is not for us. It is bad for us. That is not a fascist, obviously, or I hope it's obvious. And yet that sort of argument has been sort of used, that Dessalines' authoritarianism is the sort of ground upon which Duvalierism sort of is possible. And so the argument that I make in the chapter is, well, no, I mean, what Duvalierism does is takes this ideology that I'm tracing, this integral nationalism, it's Catholic, it's blood and soily, it's all, by the way, as you mentioned, Alex, everywhere in the 30s, right? It's a hot thing to be doing in the 30s. And it's Duvalierism is taking that, but then it's also collapsing it and taking away any of the critique that might be at work in that, and putting it in the service of a dictatorship. And so that doesn't answer your question about left and right. left and right it's tough. It's certainly, I mean, I'll think more about that. I think I did a good job of not falling into sort of something simplistic there. I think especially in the 20s and 30s, with what's going on in Europe and then in the lead up to World War II, there's something there where the use of a blood and soil, the use of a kind of nationalism like that is it's valuable. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we have Julia Gaffield who's joining us. Julia, do you want to come on camera and ask your question?
I'm trying. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for providing us with this opportunity. And thanks to Chelsea for writing this book. I want to pull out one of my favorite sentences and just ask you to talk a little bit more about it. And so this is in the context of talking about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. And you say, this is the most annoying thing a person can do. I'm reading you back to yourself. That Dessalines would reject versions lacking the requisite tone and imagery is entirely consistent with his view of writing as an anti-colonial weapon. And I love this phrase, writing as an anti-colonial weapon, specifically for Dessalines. And so I'm just, and the book as a whole does this. I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the silencing of text in Haiti's representations throughout the last 200 plus years and ongoing, and the use of illiteracy or claims of illiteracy as a kind of colonial weapon, and therefore the kind of the logic of exclusion. So I love that phrase, writing as an anti-colonial weapon, and specifically attached with Dessalines. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that question. I mean, as you're talking, I'm like, well, yes. I'm hearing Césaire, and I won't go there, but I'm just bouncing off of Alex's earlier question. And I want to gesture to Julia's really excellent work on the Declaration of Independence and her Dessalines document reader that's online that you should absolutely go check out and be using if you're not. Yeah, I mean, writing is the ground I stand on in this entire book, and it's so important. For me, I mean, it's obviously the place where I felt the most comfortable to be able to make any kind of intervention, but also because it's all there. I mean, there not only is sort of the Declaration such a crucial piece, but there is so much writing that comes from that period. You know, too much writing, the bureaucratic writing, which is something I'm working on right now, but just scores and scores and scores and scores and scores of and piles of things and to be read, and that were part of this anti-colonial project. And so your question about what illiteracy and sort of those narratives, I'm thinking about Marlene Dout's work on the Enlightenment literacy narrative, but also Greg Pierrot has done work on this, and Deborah Jensen. The idea that, Dessalines was illiterate or not, or really that writing, I mean, there is a way that writing happens and a way that writing gets produced that is absolutely part of rendering legible Haiti in the Atlantic world. And so the fact that writing is so little known or so little studied, and I guess that's maybe where I'm getting with the Césaire, like all of the writing of the period is doing this work of anti-colonialism, and is doing the work of asserting and refuting this sort of vindicationist discourse. And so that's the hope with the book too. And I know with so many other projects that people are doing, is making this writing accessible, analyzing it and engaging with it in a way that sort of can continue to refute this sort of, I would call it worthless illiteracy sort of narrative. Thanks.
We have one hand. Oh, there it is. Laura. Hi, Laura. You want to come in? You want to unmute yourself? And let me add you there. There you go. I need you to unmute, Laura.
Thought I had. There you go. Is that better? I had not. Chelsea, thank you for the book. I waited for this, and I would like to. I don't think Sharon Roberts is here. I don't know if you've met her. But Sharon is the person who introduced me. She's in mass communication and actually started working on modern journalism, but she, for her sins, needed a historian to sit in on a field because she wrote a field paper at Tulane on 19th century Haitians writing about Haiti and more about what they published in the national history. I have not had a chance to read the book. I eagerly bought it and then realized, oh crap, this is this month, not April. But I actually had two questions. There's so much struggle outside of Haiti and within about what Haiti means. And in a past life, all right, I was an undergraduate obsessed with elite-led occupation to the US occupation of Haiti. And my advisor at the time, who was a historian of peasant radicals, he asked me, he said, well, what the Union Patriotique and a bunch of people thinking and writing to one another, how does that relate to mass struggle and mass sense of identity? And he was asking me that in the context of the US occupation, in the context in which there was, in fact, a guerrilla war and there was a very present enemy. And it seemed a reasonable question. But I likewise wondered about how we, and it gets to questions about nationalism and what it means and who gets to author it. The kinds of debates that you are engaging here about the nature of the nation and what regionalism is and how you sort of, when do political alliances speak to one another. If you could say something about how you envision that kind of speaking to those masses, because I don't like that question, but I do think it's an interesting one to engage. And, you know, people here who know me know I always have other questions, but that's the one I'm throwing with right now.
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it. And it's a question that I asked myself early on. I think I was asked that question early on when I was working on the book, and I address it in the introduction, but in a way that I sort of, as I alluded to in the previous question, I work on text, I work on published text, and not all. So there's a bit of manuscript in there, not really. It's published text. You know, I'm interested in texts that are seeking a public, you know, for a specific reason. But that question of mass struggle is, and so I just, you know, in my introduction, I say, you know, there are absolutely other ways of getting at sort of struggle that's either outside of text or beyond text. But I think that there is a way to also consider these texts as representative of that mass struggle as well. I mean, and there, I'm gonna pivot and also in my book discussion pull up another book, which is Jean Casimir's The Haitians, a decolonial history, where he is precisely looking at that question of mass struggle, and he defines the nation as the Haitians, below, but also outside of sort of text, and it's an amazing book, and I am continuing to live in it. But what I find really interesting about his argument about the Haitians and how he, again, is outside of text for those very same reasons, is that for him, Dessalines is an exception, which is to say his whole story of telling the story of the Haitians, right? The Madame Sarah, the peasant civilian or the peasant citizen, the family, the Lacou, makes sense separate from the nation, or they are the nation, except for that Dessalines for him is an exception, right? We see some of that happening in the 1804 to 1806 period and a bit before. So yeah, I am not aiming, and certainly in my book did not aim to get at that mass sentiment, but I did want to question the degree to which leaders or sort of conceptions of the nation were more interested in or attempting to get at that mass sentiment. And I think Dessalines absolutely did. I think sort of political writing, or even one could say cultural traditions that sort of are activating a Dessalinian way of thinking about the nation, are trying to at least gesture culturally to that. Whereas the Republican sort of faction is very interested in, Alex had a good way of phrasing it that I'm not going to remember, but it's concerned with representation and how they looked to the outside. And so, you know, it wasn't so much interested in activating or even looking to be representative of that mass sentiment. So yeah, I'll sort of leave that there.
Yeah, exactly. I like the question, and I'm interested in when in the 20th century people, intellectuals of this kind, start claiming that they do reflect mass sentiment and those kinds of things. So.
Oh, do you, in the 20th century as well? Yeah. But I mean, you know, which mass too? I mean, I'm thinking about sort of like, where are we talking about the proletariat or the peasantry? There's the sort of 1920s Price-Marzian nationalism, but there's a much longer sort of heritage of being able to sort of not speak for, but be able to represent, and that is happening. I mean, there are peasant movements in the 1850s, 40s and 50s that are absolutely sort of about finding representation in sort of, and really in the 1820s as well. So it definitely precedes that moment that I think most people know about in Haiti.
Thank you. Anna, I think is next. Yes.
Okay, then again, Chelsea, thank you so much for this book that I am still working on it. And I knew part of what you presented earlier in the slavery seminar at Howard. I would have two questions. One of them was a little bit addressed in the answer that you gave to Rosanne. The first one is that you make the point in the introduction and throughout the book that you prefer Maggio's Histoire d'Haïti as the work that you privilege, and I would like you to tell us a little bit more why this work is the most important for you in terms of these published primary sources that you work in the book. And the second question is that, of course, we are interacting on social media and also in person when you were able to meet in person. And we have all this new generation of wonderful women scholars who are doing work on Haiti. Then, of course, you, Marlene Dowd, Julia Garfield, Alisa Sepinal as well. And the works that you use, the authors that are publishing and that are part of this paper war, they are mostly men. And of course, you are saying that your interest is what was published and what was written to be then made public. I would like you to tell us a little bit about what you found in the sources in terms of women as writers in Haiti, then during the period that you are examining here. Thank you.
Thank you for these two questions. They're both great. So Maggio, I would say Maggio Thomas Maggio over Beaubrun Ardouin, which is, I mean, for most scholars of Haiti, I won't say it's a choice, but it's one that I decided to make in the book. I mean, and I will also admit that my really, and I hope I phrase it this way in the book, it's for lack of a better one, I picked Maggio. Which is to say, I read Ardouin, I read Saint-Rémy, I read sort of the other histories from the 19th century, but Maggio, I have found, and I do think, though problematic, and though I really did try to always, when I'm relying on Maggio, say I'm relying on Maggio, rather than, I mean, there are histories that you can read or scholarship on Haiti where Maggio just is in the footnote, you know, like, but Maggio says this and so I did try to create a little distance there. But so he relies on oral histories. That's something that was part of his methodology, which was really essential. I find Ardouin to be the sort of the other option for really having a good narrative of the revolution and really the early post-independence period, because that is where there's the least. Ardouin is really is really problematic. He has a real problem with Dessalines, with Christophe. Now it's not, I guess, another way I could have gone was to say, well, I'm going to use Ardouin because he has some good sources. And I think I did use a source here or there from Ardouin because it's in him, it's in his work, and just sort of carve out or really not sort of pay attention to his sort of editorializing. But for me, I mean, yeah, given that it was really for just periodization purposes, I found that using Maggio was, again, for lack of a better one, the right one to use. And there's more people who are doing work on Maggio as a historian. His autobiography just recently got published. That wasn't a found text, but that hadn't been published before. And so I'm sure there'll be much more sort of to say about him in the future. But that was my choice that I made, Maggio over Ardouin. As far as women scholars on Haiti, I see Nadev Ménard also in the chat, or in the list of people, and she's also a scholar in Haiti who's doing excellent work. And yeah, I am working on mostly men who published, but there are both. Well, there's a bunch of people who are doing really excellent work on female revolutionaries and female Maroons, and that work is going to be stellar. There are also scholars who are doing work, you know, on, I'm thinking about all the people, especially in the Slavery Archive book club, who are doing tons of work on like the meanings of freedom, the meanings of liberté. And it is absolutely essential to see women revolutionaries as thinking, and really frankly under slavery and after, as thinking about freedom differently than the liberté that I'm sort of charting out in the political sense. A properly political sense, I guess you could say. But in terms of women writers, because that is where where I'm on steady ground. So there, Deborah Jensen actually did some really interesting work on manuscripts in the revolutionary period, sort of the colonial period. And so there is absolutely female writing. There are female playwrights. There's a female literary culture in Haiti pre-revolution. Post-revolution, it is heavily masculine. But there are some sort of interesting of women writers, interesting moments. Under Suluk, there's a woman who's in the court of Suluk who writes a poem and she publishes it in the national newspaper. That's a big moment. You know, it's late. It's it's like 1852 or 53. There's also a fascinating mention in a Northern scholar of a woman who kept a sort of a journal and a sort of a personal travelogue in the late 19th century in the North. I haven't been able to find it, but there are women who are participating. But I think what is maybe a more interesting way to get at that, and then the 20th century, there's really a heavy representation of women, or more so, right? And there's more to do. I think a more interesting way to get at the question, especially in the 19th century, is to see the way that women are represented, and representations of women are really tied to the nation, right? They are the womb of the nation. They are the sort of the fertile ground of the nation, and so that really becomes sort of the primary. And there's a woman who is freedom embodied in a Republican 1850 novel. So that's sort of the way to get at women in the 19th century post-revolution in writing.
Thank you. Jessica has the next question.
You said you were going to have questions. I've got my pencil.
I have so many questions. I'm not gonna ask them all. I'm not gonna ask them all. I'm gonna ask two now, and then I'll save two if people have questions later. So I really enjoyed this book. It's so rich. It's so fascinating. It adds to, of course, like the amazing work that is happening. Like people already mentioned, Marlena, Julia, so many, Dixa, folks who are grappling with the post, essentially like the post 1804 Haiti. So that's in some ways one of my questions. So I, of course, am coming to this book from the earlier side of 1804, essentially, like from the 18th century side, and also from the I guess the disciplinary vantage point of Atlantic slavery, Atlantic history, African diaspora, a diaspora that sees Haiti in these kind of iconic ways that you're really challenging us to look deeper at, like not to look at it as iconic, but to look at it in different ways, right? As more complex than, you know, the anti-slavery free Black Republic, like that. It's actually much richer than that, which is, again, part of a cohort of work that is so important. And I think that you're absolutely right to tag those of us on this side for valorizing Haiti, for calling it a republic earlier than that would count, and where it does not count. So I'm actually wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you would ask of us to do with these texts and with the political ideologies that you are grappling with and that you're surfacing for us. What do you want us to change in how we think about maybe the earlier period, or how we look forward into 1804 and beyond, 1803 and beyond, 1791 and beyond? What do you want us to, are there ways that we can look at that differently that can better incorporate these, ideological changes, ideological challenges that face Haiti, that face, across the Caribbean, is not like unique to Haiti, but in a lot of ways, well, actually, that might be my second question. So what would you have us do who are on the other side of 1804, and how would you want us to take up these texts and these ideologies? And the other one is exactly that kind of question, is, and not to valorize Haiti still perhaps, but there's so many ways that, when I'm reading it, I'm like, yes, like once again, Haiti and Haitian history becomes not even a litmus test, but like a different kind of mirror on liberal humanism, a different kind of mirror on empire, a different kind of mirror on the republic and republicanism and revolutionary era. And, I don't move too far into the 20th century, but a different look at nationalism. Like, there's so much here that, even if the diaspora is not making Haiti like its standard bearer of free Black resistance, whatever those words decide to mean, in whose hands they have meaning, Haiti is still iconic for illuminating all the things that are in some ways that we do and do not want to see in this world, in this Caribbean basin. And so I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about that, but that question I actually would love to, for you to answer, but I would love even more chatter from folks who are here, because the whole gang is here. And I want to hear folks talk about, like, what do we want? That's something they thought all the way up through the 20th century, all of this is very complicated. And I want us to hold the contradictions and complications, but also I wonder, like, what do we want to do with that? Like, what do we, and not in a bad way, but like in what then is the world that we want that thought to help us imagine? Because if you threw into like, and I'm gonna stop here, but if you throw like anti-slavery empire into a place like social media, they're like, no, empire can't be anti-slavery. It's like these impossible binaries that you get caught into, which I think is, is something about the not complexity of social media in the public sphere, but it's also about like, do we have a too limited imagination? Do we have to broaden out? I don't know. Like, so that's just a broad question. It's like, okay, so what is this world that we want to come about, in the same way that people make Haiti iconic, because there's a certain kind of world that they want to come about with Haiti as representing that, even if that's not the facts of what Haiti is. And I'll stop there.
Don't stop. That was fantastic. Yes. No, I mean, what I want you to have thoughts like that. And then I want you to write about that. And I want you to think about that. Right. I mean, like, yes, no, I mean, and I said this really in the book, in wanting to, and actually let me back up, because maybe this just situates it. There was this moment in the Slavery Memory and African Diaspora workshop. Again, it was just mind blowing for me, really getting that opportunity to do it, where a senior scholar in Ana Lucia's department was like, but what are you telling me about the Black Republic? And like, what do we do with the Black Republic with what you're saying? And I was like, I know. And like, but that's it. Like but it can be all of those things. And I'm just flip through to the end in the epilogue to get like a little review on all of the things that Haiti is for other people. But like, I think, I mean, and again, I agree. I want to open that up to the chatter. I want to think about hear what other people have to say, but certainly what I want people to do, and what, again, the whole purpose of this book Some like a few people have said, and I didn't think it was a backhanded compliment. I think it was definitely, but whatever. They're like, your book is such a service. And it is true that I'm like, I want, here it is, right? Like, take it. And then I want you to do stuff with it too, because I can, you know, and I am in a sense working in a narrow, you know, French studies is influencing it, but I don't have that, that same language, or I'm not working in those same dialogues. And so what I want people to do is read those texts and then also think about them. But yes, challenge. I mean, one big takeaway that has really become crystal clear to me now is that liberalism as a concept and as something that's operating right now is both like the water that we are in and social media, the news, like whatever, like that is something that absolutely requires continual sort of unpacking. And it is the thing that the current protests, and I put in the link a really great conversation that NACLA and HSA and Aiba Post just had. But like, yeah, that liberalism is the thing that has been working itself out in Haiti since 1806. It's been the thing that has been serving itself in Haiti since 1806. And so that is absolutely essential to our present day to understand. It will make sense in every period that we look at. And that's one thing. But no, even the ideas that you've started to sort of tease out are the ideas that I like just hope that this is fertilizer to like put on and see grow.
I think we have Marlene Dowd, sorry, in the wings. There she is.
Hi, Chelsea. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for setting this up. This is wonderful. I just wanted to offer some praise for Chelsea's wonderful book. Among all the things that Jessica and others have pointed out that this book is doing, one of the things I really appreciate is that Chelsea has structured a study of literary print culture, historical print culture, cultural studies that revolves around Haitian events, that revolves around Haitian authors, Haitian concepts, people and theorists from Haiti. And it's not overdetermined by the French Revolution. It's not overdetermined by the US occupation. Those are moments along Haiti's path and a trajectory in her study that we see Haitians are determining their own political sphere, especially throughout the 19th century. And I think that this is one of the works that will be remembered from this era for the way that it takes seriously Haitian political thought, Haitian politicians, Haitian newspapers, as not overly obsessed with what's happening in France, what's happening in the United States, and where Haitian politicians and Haitian writers and authors and government officials are putting the country on the path that they would like to see it go down, including empires at various points and monarchies, and taking those seriously as political projects. So I just wanted to say thank you to Chelsea, and I can't wait to see what you do next with your next project.
Thank you, Marlena. I'm glad this is recorded.
That was really nice. You want to respond?
I mean, that's, yes, so nice, but also, yes, I got to do what I got to do because Marlena does her work. So, I mean, thank you, Marlena. Truly, like this idea of centering Haiti, this idea of just the absolute, really, I mean, now with a step away, Marlena's book came out in 2015, but like a step away from that, with some time, the absurdity of the really narrow way that Haiti is narrated, is written about, is both silenced and completely and totally loudly written about, the uses, the idea of Haiti, like that, again, is all possible because of Marlena's work. So thank you.
Do you feel though that, is this something you set out to do? Because you do it really well. And even those scenes, like for example, trolling, like where you trolling Louis, like before, like you pointed out, like it hadn't occurred to me that, oh yeah, this is 2 years before, and this is even those moments in which the vector does point outward, you still don't leave Haiti. So I was just wondering if this is like super intentional for you at every step of the way, like every page, and it's because of Marlena's work. All right.
No, that's a good, I appreciate that. Honestly, like I really mean that when I was setting this up. I understand France because I know Haiti. Like that shift that happened to me, and it was early in graduate school, and Michael Dash, like, yes, like that was so foundational for me and other people who were in Africana Studies department there. Ada Ferrer, like people, like when again, and this gets actually to some of the contemporary discussions. You mentioned Napoleon the First, who is having his moment in France right now, which is hugely problematic in a lot of ways. But like in this idea of French universalism and sort of my own sort of received Francophilia that I hadn't quite sort of troubled enough when I was in graduate school, like again, I understand France so much now that I understand Haiti, and that just becomes the lens through which I see it. So I wouldn't say so much I set out to do it. It is the only way I know how to do it, I think. But I also will say, Jean Casimir's book is really, again, like so transformational. I'm so excited for more people to read it. But I also like that it makes sense when you, like Marlena does and like so many other people do, when you sort of hang around in Haitian texts for a very long time. Right, like the way of thinking about certain events. I mean, even 1806, like in this event that again, I tagged and I really encourage people to watch. 1806 is a really important point today. To talk about because of property rights and because of sort of the direction that the country is taken and because of liberalism. And like none of that's not available in a non, like or it's much less obvious in a non sort of Haitian based way. So I guess that's what I'd say. That answers your question.
Thank you. Rachel, coming to us from the British Isles in Scotland. Go ahead, Rachel, take it away.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed this book, which actually I read at the same time as I was reading Jean Casimir's book. So I was kind of cross-reading them, and that was really good. And yeah, I learned so much about, the discussion about Haitian discourse, critique. It was really fascinating. So thank you very much for the book. Yeah, I don't really have a question as such, but one thing that I found very interesting was the part on the refutation pamphlets, and how they provided this kind of point-by-point rebuttal, and they would do things like rewrite Malouet, and I was wondering if you had any more to say about that.
I find myself saying a lot about that, so I appreciate the question. Thank you for this, your question, Rachel, and also just for being engaged with the book. I really appreciate it. And Rachel wrote a really excellent book, Making the Black Jacobin, so that's good to highlight. I feel like people when they ask a question to be like, I wrote this also to take some of that spotlight too. But so the refutation pamphlets, that I really think, I'm actually thinking about it right now in a project or just an article I'm working on. But yeah, it's this practice of taking space and making space in the sense of critique, but also in the sense of sort of claiming the right to publish, be in the public sphere, but also then to, with evidence, like refute point by point by point. And I think there's a lot, and Doris Garraway has some really good work on this. She's footnoted throughout, but I wanted to highlight her too. But so there's really this idea of vindication and refutation, really as forms of argument, but even like a form of rhetoric to show ones, like I have joked about this elsewhere, but like bring the receipts. I mean, like that's literally what is happening. Like, here is our evidence. Here is this text. Here I'm going to cite from this letter, and I'm going to have appendix A, B, and C to show you these things, so that no longer can sort of French discourse of colonialism be just what it is, the unidirectional sort of word. And so to see that on the space of the page, to me, is super powerful, but also like intentional, right? It's this unweaving of a text by interspersing the rebuttals. It works orally, but also is really effective on the space of the page. So there's sort of a cultural materiality to it. And it is so widespread. sort of some of the things that have been interesting about and what this article is trying to look at is where that comes from. I think it's very much part of the 18th century, just sort of period. So it's not like they're necessarily inventing something new, but it's the way that it becomes this seizure of the right, or like they're seizing the right to be able to do this, and they're doing it in the page, and they're sending it everywhere. There's something that to me is a sort of a performance of the same kinds of things that they're doing elsewhere. And they're fun to read and look at.
All right, so we have Jesus Ruiz is next up. Are you able to turn on your video? Hey, fantastic.
There we go. Hi, Chelsea. Thank you so much. I cannot overstate how much this book is just blowing my mind. And this is not hyperbole. This is going to be foundational to my work moving forward. So I just really just, first of all, thank you. And thank you to everybody for setting this up, for us junior scholars just to be amongst these legends here. I'm very happy. Two questions that I think could maybe touch on Jessica's original question. What do we want this to do? And also Marlena's point about taking serious political histories that don't fall neatly into sort of, as you so eloquently read about, Chelsea, the teleologies of the Republic, et cetera, et cetera. My first question, and to be honest, one of my favorite parts of your book is your analysis of Émile No's Histoire des Caciques, and linking the island's Amerindian history of resistance and violence to sort of this broader question of how colonialism engenders that very violence that, of course, as we know, is portrayed as solely black on white violence later in the 19th century. So if you could talk a little bit more about that particular section, that would be amazing. And then the second question is this issue of performativity and public performance in Dessalinian conceptions and the uses of writing. But it reminded me, and I guess to kind of also put I was reading your book along with Herman Bennett's African Kings and Black Slaves, and it really reminded me of how he talks about how politics as performativity, as this sort of ritual, I guess we could say, was that precisely was the politics, right? And I think reading your book, I just kept going back and forth with that idea, with as far as Herman Bennett's work in the early modern Atlantic. So I'll leave it at that. But thank you, thank you so much.
I thought my introduction was going to be self-indulgent, but getting to hear all these questions feels very, again, I'm just glad this is recorded so I can go back and watch it later when I got rejected from something, or I don't know. So thank you, Jesus, for these questions. And I am very excited for your work on the eastern side of the island and on Spain. So I'm that this will be generative, or at least in conversation with that, is really exciting for me. Yes, I love Nos Histoire des Caciques. But it comes under the under the Second Empire, under Suluk's empire. And there's something that he's doing. And this actually gets back to Ana Lucia's question about the historians that I sort of had to pick from and who's writing about what. I mean, this is a period where the Republic is in exile, and where a lot of writing is taking place in France from exiled Republicans who are trying to sort of narrate an idea of the revolution as civilized, right? They're trying to really intervene. It's this like really interesting culminating moment in the middle of the 19th century. And here I'm actually thinking of Julia Gaffield's work on Haiti's search for recognition, even beyond really the indemnity, and really trying to perform its civilization to be sort of part of this family of nations. And so what's happening, I see, and how I'm reading No, is really looking at another way of conceiving of Haiti's revolution, which is not new, right? He's recuperating these very Dessalinian Baron de Vatté in Marlena's work, ways of conceiving of the heritage of Haiti's revolution that's written in all the documents of independence, which is one, and in the naming of Haiti, which is this bringing together of the Amerindian massacre and the violence that they faced, and their, refusal, right, their decision to fight, to live free and die, and then the horrors of slavery and enslavement. And so, so there is an element of violence that is both central to their treatment, right? That they're bringing together, these two twin sort of wrongs or evils, but then also Dessalines' decision to perform this act of anti-colonial vengeance in killing the remaining French on the island after independence. And so, but again, he's like leaning into this violence, right? He's not writing over it. He's not writing it out. That becomes part of what is essential to understanding Haiti's foundation and this history that he's doing that's much longer. And that is a crucial, right? It's a crucial moment because it's happening at this time. I can't not read it as in conversation with these other ways of writing Haiti and these other ways of writing the revolution. And I guess that actually I'd love to talk about it more. There's so much more that's there. But I think this question of performativity is actually related to it as well, which, and I'm getting at it in a couple different ways, but I see all of these rescriptings and presentations of what the meaning of Haiti is and the revolution that I trace throughout the book as performative in a sense, or in the sense that they are trying to, they're trying to depict a certain political, but also cultural and ideological idea. But that's not the performativity necessarily that I was thinking about specifically with Dessalinian writing, which really is the performance is a speech act or an utterance, which I do sort of get at, but that's really what is necessary to do in a post-independence state that has not been granted legitimacy and that is not seen as legitimate in the eyes of the Atlantic world. And Vanessa Manger's book, Rogue Revolutionaries, really gets at that question of like legitimacy and what it means to be able to sort of claim legitimacy as an independent state in the age of revolution. And so what the refutation pamphlets actually that Rachel asked me about are all part of this. It's a way of using to claim the right to do something performatively to make it sort of real. But what you're talking about with Herman Bennett obviously is essential too, and that's a crucial part of this early practice of statehood, which is the visual, which is the ceremony, which is all of those. That is what the politics is in a way. And so the degree to which those foundational texts, they're central because they're read and they're shared and they're part of the sort of internal foundation, but they also have to be legible and performed in that very sort of speech acty sense in an Atlantic world to claim power. That answers. Thanks for your question and for your work.
Thank you, Jesus. And now we have Greg. Hey, salut.
How's it going? Thank you for organizing this. Thank you, Chelsea, for your book and for this great conversation. I'm going to try to keep it short because I'm really just going back to a point you started making earlier, and that is of special interest to me, I guess, and to other people, I'm sure. You mentioned in passing, it's the year of Napoleon in France, and much of the conversation, whether that was willful or not at this point, has come to involve publicly the memory of Haiti. And so I want to go back to your comment you made that I thought was interesting. When you said, Haiti, but also your work in this book has made you look at France differently. And so I guess the question is simply, what does France look like in the light of your work? How differently do you see it now? And maybe, maybe that's obvious, but I'm assuming you mean France in 1820 and 1806 and 1825, but also possibly France in 2021.
That was actually really short and enormous as a question. So I wish you would have talked longer so I could have had more time to organize my thoughts. No, I appreciate that question, especially because it allows me to, again, I don't know, center myself, whatever. Yes, I actually, when it makes me look at France differently, yes, it makes me look at France differently during those periods, absolutely. But it really makes me look at France, contemporary France differently, like France 1990s, 2000s today, and understand it in a way that I really was without the tools to understand it and see. And so well, I'll talk about France today, but then I'll go back to sort of what Haiti makes me look at and how it makes me understand, or maybe to narrate that. And maybe this, I mean, I know, Greg, you know, but for other people who are listening, I mean, French universalism is, I believe people have called it quite a drug, but it's a lot of things, but it's a narrative and it's a story. And so this is this idea that France can not see or not sort of accept race as a social construction. It cannot acknowledge religion or really these forms of difference because all French are citizens first, and that this is sort of the way that the nation gets held together. So you know, coming up in grad school, I've heard so many people sort of talk about this in such compelling ways, the problems, the limits of French universalism, which is what sort of I was alluding to before, and their experiences having lived that. And I, you know, studied in France and lived there briefly and all that, but that was not my experience. My experience was really just the learning, right? The reading and the sort, and even if I'm being honest, teaching from like textbooks when I was doing my first sort of foray into doing like a civ class here or there and being like, wait a minute, like I can't use this. Like, what is this? Like a just a regular like Cengage textbook that was really shockingly uncritical about laïcité and about universalism and all of that. So sort of on the one hand, I felt like a little bit trapped because I didn't have the tools to sort of understand how to get out of that kind of thinking, or where I could come at and sort of get in there and show it, but it's such a hermetically sort of sealed narrative. And then with that, began sort of reading and unpacking sort of what Haiti was, both within sort of an institutional context in French and Francophone studies in the Institute of French Studies, but understanding what Haiti was in all of these times for France. And what I realized, or what sort of I came to a conclusion at the end was that, well, Haiti represents everything that sort of like France, even, you know, in 1794, or really, frankly, 1802, 1804, was not able to like realize or achieve. Or I guess to put it differently, like Haiti was the opportunity to realize these most sort of radical universalist conceptions of the Enlightenment upon which the French Republic was founded, and then lost during most of the 19th century up until 1870, and then that sort of got reinscribed into a national identity with the Third Republic. But that Haiti was living sort of differently and was living separately from these conceptions to try and retell over and over and over again and reinscribe what France's past meant. So it becomes, I mean, I think Jessica brought up the idea of a mirror. To me, it is a place that will continually trouble whatever story France wants to tell about itself. It will continually bring up, for like what Alex was saying about sort of, yeah, well, Suluk founded his empire before Napoleon III did. But I mean, even 1848, the indemnity, the attempts to sort of recolonize throughout the early 19th century. It brings up all of the realities about France's colonial past that just continue to get not told. So that's what sort of Haiti has done for me in France, and lots of other, I guess, smaller things. But how do I look at France now? I mean, I guess I probably answered that, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's quite a question, but actually, I'm glad that we got to see, to quote a friend, to see France under the microscope of Haiti. It's much better than what we get usually. So who is going to ask us, who asked Chelsea the next question? Because I know that I have more left, and I know Jessica has some left. So We have Nadif Menat. Yes. Do you want to come in video?
No, I don't think my internet can handle that.
We can hear you though, so if you want, you can ask your question. Yes.
Yes, I will. Hi, Chelsea, everyone. Chelsea, thanks so much for your book and this great discussion. I really, to reiterate what Marlena was saying, I really appreciated reading your book about how you centered Haiti and Haitians and allowed the story to be about the stories Haitians were telling themselves about each other. That's something that I don't see a lot in the foreign scholarship. And listening to this discussion that has been really, really good, I'm coming back to this idea about the masses in one of the earlier questions. And I think that the ways in which your book helps us to kind of complicate the ideas that we have of Haitians and see that there are all of these different regions and factions and conflicts going on, even as the outside world tends to have this singular view of what Haiti is, can maybe help us answer this earlier question, right? Because as, for example, the Union Patriotique was writing letters and marching and so addressing the US and talking to elites, they were also participating in other activities that maybe have not left the same written traces, right? So it's not like there was this separation between what was going on among the elites and what was going on in the masses. And to bring it to, for example, what's going on today, we see a lot of what you posted are the written kind of articles, petitions, discussions, and that is available. I think it's very useful. It's available for the world to see, but there's a lot that's happening inside, right? With Haitians talking to each other. And oftentimes it's the same people who are participating differently depending on who the audience is. So I don't think we can count on this distinction between literate, illiterate, elite, mass to kind of say, well, this group is thinking this and doing this, and this group is thinking this and doing that, because there's a lot of conflict, yes, but also a lot of connections between the various groups. I mean, we're a small place, so it's hard to keep groups completely distinct. And so people are talking to each other. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, for those of us who are in literature, it's the written trace that is left, right? And that's what we see. But that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of conversation and discussion happening otherwise that we just don't have traces of any longer. But just really thank you for the book.
Thank you for that, Nadev, and that really crucial sort of clarification that you're making. And I actually readily admit to when I get that question, knowing that, like, you know, it is not what I do, kind of being like, well, I do the writing and that's what I do. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right. And frankly, even thinking about and your precision or your clarification on what is happening now is so crucial too. I think Edwidge Dontica in one of her talks sort of more recently was just talking about, and Evelyne Trouillot as well, was talking about sort of engagement and the sort of activities that they're doing with kids, with different groups. And yes, of course, that's going to inform the way that they do write, to the degree that it's either sort of addressed as, you know, here is the conversation that I had with X, or just informing more of a narration or an interpretation. So I appreciate that. And also, I mean, this idea of plurality too is an idea that Nadev wrote in an article about sort of the myth of the monolingual Haitian writer. It is excellent, and if I can get that, or if you could put it in the chat, or I'll find it and put it in the chat. But that's this idea of plurality, like, was so foundational. And Nathan Dyes sent me a link to it in the long ago, and was like, "This is something that you're absolutely thinking about." So, you know, all of these conversations are happening together and with one another. So I really appreciate that. Thanks, Nadev.
Okay, let's see if you have any more questions. Not from the chat, not from YouTube. I think that Alex and Jessica, perhaps you can just jump in.
Yeah, Jessica, you wanna? Well, if I may, one of the things that struck me and I might be wrong about this, but I just couldn't help think it towards the beginning of the book, in the first couple of chapters, as I saw these two strands kind of start taking shape, and like you give them a lot of definition, right? There's a lot of definitional work happening in there. I couldn't, and you of course assign them to camps, and fairly enough, but I couldn't help but seeing them reconcile, synthesize avant la lettre in the figure of Toussaint. It was almost as if Toussaint, who is absent, or at least this begins after him, is, and he's echoed.
Absent, it's okay.
Yeah, he's echoed many times, but the temporality of the book begins right after he's no longer physically on the scene, right? And yet, like, I can see the two strands in him, you know, or maybe, I mean, it's, maybe I'm getting in trouble here with the Haitian Studies group, but is this something you thought about? And in what ways does in what ways do you feel this relates to? Then how do we see before this period based on your work?
It's a really good question, and I mean, again, lots of what I would have done. No, I mean, I think when I was writing this, I was like, oh no, like I have to write the 1791 to 1804 chapter, and then I like was behind on time. It was already like 20,000 words over. It's already long. Like it wasn't going to happen. And that was hard, but also something I was okay with, right? Like, you know, especially since I already written the introduction and it was like, this book begins in 1804, like whatever. I mean, it was too much, but I actually am. So the article I'm working on is about 1791 to 1804, actually like say 1785. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, that's what's so interesting about the pre-revolutionary period, or really, sorry, the revolutionary period pre-independence, and the thought that is sort of all around in the massive textual, I mean, again, thinking about textual production in particular and the kinds of writing that's happening, but like from Julien Raymond early on to André Rigaud in the middle of the 1790s, and Toussaint as well, and these conflicts, his sort of general liberty, but the forced labor component. Yeah, I mean, and I really think an important part of that, and that's getting kind of back to this performativity question that was asked earlier, is, yeah, and again, this is what Deborah Jensen and Greg Pierrot have written about. Toussaint is really working a lot of that. And I think that's something that I hope came through with Dessalines especially, but these camps, and there are other ways to have organized it, but this is sort of what became clear to me. That Toussaint is really is working that, right? He's performing, but he's also spinning perhaps, and he's also using these ideas that have been written about Haiti to sort of work with power and to sort of create an image, an idea, the one that's very useful, but also sort of expedient in some ways. So it's, yes, it's all there, this earlier period. And I think in particular, sort of rhetoric and ways of writing are really, that through line is so clear. But the different camps that are starting to form and the different ways that that's sort of taking shape are also there. And this actually, I was thinking about Jessica's book, I was thinking about Vanessa Monge's book, and this idea of what republicanism is and how that like what the ideas about liberty, about property, about colorblind sort of ideals, equality, like what equality are they talking about? What liberty are they talking about? What rights are they talking about? And that to me is also a very clear through line from like the Julien Raymond and the André Rigaud of that period through to this earlier sort of the later Pétion period. So it's all there. I didn't write it faute de temps, and also because it was too long, but I'm working on that now, and I think it's an absolutely a valid critique. And the Toussaint of it all obviously is super important too. And I would say we need fewer new Toussaint biographies and probably more situating him in the context and thinking about sort of the post-independence period, but that's just me. Oh, and actually I know there's another question, but I just wanted to come back actually, because this performativity got me thinking about your question about fascism, Alex, too, later on. And I think one thing that I would have done differently, and that I'm really trying to think through with the Caribbean Fascism Project, is the space that I give to Toussaint in my mind, not in the book, but also Dessalines and Pétion to an extent, and so many of these other people who are or leaders and writers who are performing their concepts of the state and their ideology. I don't give that same ability or really I don't maybe allow for that breathing room with the chapter on integral nationalism. Like, it's very possible that a lot of these writers in the 30s, 20s and 30s, frankly, were looking at a way of writing and engaging with a certain kind of political thoughts that was useful for them. I mean, like in the sense that like it had currency and maybe made sense, you know, on a international scale. I mean, right, that I really tried hard in the early chapters to, again, keep it in this idea of performativity. And like, I don't know what anyone believed, right? Like I can say what I know they wrote, and I know why they did it, and I know how they sort of entered into the public sphere. And I think I could have maintained a little bit more of that spirit for the later writers.
So we have Ryan next. He wrote a question in the comments. We just wanted, Ryan, do you want to come on video or just put the sound on and ask the question?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks, and thank you, Chelsea, and everyone that organized the event. I'm really happy to share this space with you. Unfortunately, I haven't read your book yet, Chelsea, but I'm planning on doing so very soon. I was wondering if you might speak a little bit about, because you mentioned early on your methodology of close reading. And if you see, I can just read the question, and I think that you and Nadev were starting to get at the question that I'm asking. If you see Haitian fiction in particular as reimagining, multiplying, or destabilizing the idea of Haiti in distinct ways. And you had mentioned 2 dashes, someone that you had worked with, right, or been a student of, and that had me thinking about his book, Haiti in the US. But I had a second question, if I can too, whenever you mentioned, how Haiti makes us think about France in different ways. And I'm wondering if, especially considering everything going on right now, how Haiti changes how we might relate to the United States, right, in different ways, considering kind of like the paternalistic attitude and discourse around Haiti in the United States. So thank you.
Thank you. 2 very big questions, ones that I'm, happy to think through, but, I would like those to sit sort of for everyone in their minds. So it's true that like, what do we mean by fiction? And I appreciate that you asked the question that way, because I'm not, like, literature would be too narrow, and I would have said, well, no, I mean, like, here's how I define, but no, fictions, right? We're talking about sort of imaginative writing, I think you're saying, but there's this other side of fictions, which are like the ways that Haiti is narrated, or the ways that Haiti is sort of cast and told, or rather, exported as an idea. And so what I'm doing with the text that I'm reading is always reading them as, again, I think I've overused the term performative, but I'm interested in the way that they are written. I'm interested in the ways that they are engaging with like the existing language that's already out there about Haiti, and sort of tracing through this close reading the ways that various sort of waves of sort of writing Haiti play off of one another and are embodying sort of these different strands that I'm seeing, different camps, to again borrow from Alex's term. But if we're going to categorize it, like, it's actually pretty literature, properly speaking, light. And that is, for a couple of reasons. Again, it's in the introduction to the book, but I really try and come at this idea of like, what do we mean when we talk about literature, especially when we're talking about Francophone literature? And that's so sort of bound up sort of both chronologically, sort of in the later 19th and especially the 20th century, but also with sort of the notion of what we mean when we talk about literature. Like, I think the Southern Republicans, I mean, I make a big argument about this in the book, the Southern Republicans are very much using literature in the sense that we sort of the liberal bourgeois concept of what literature is, this autonomous text that is a creative and imaginative work. But I think the close reading and the paying attention to these discursive sort of reuses and reiterations and all of that is not about literature. It's about a certain kind of reading. So I see a methodological distinction there. On the other hand, like, especially contemporary fiction in Haiti is absolutely as crucial to thinking about sort of this past Evelyne Trouillot comes to mind in particular, but that it's a way of creatively inhabiting a world, time, a space, and a set of sort of forces that is so much more profound and powerful than like my book could be, or even reading some of these original texts. Not to say that I recommend one over the other, but I think that is something that I see as separate, that I don't engage in my book, that is absolutely worthwhile. I mean, I could go into more on that, but yeah. And your question about US, like, yes, absolutely. Greg's question about France is one that's been on my mind a lot, and I'm always happy to sort of start putting Haiti on the radar of this universalism question, because it's so pernicious, the sort of hermetic universalism. But the US is absolutely operating in, frankly, like the same space and time as a imperial, like, an empire of liberty of itself, right? In quotes, of sort of neoliberal now force in Haiti. And so I would encourage, like, Haiti is a mirror for France, but it's also a mirror for the US. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you for your question.
Jessica?
So I kind of actually just put mine in the chat, which is basically like just sort of thinking about the last thread of the discussion around the 1791 to 1804 period, and also about the ways that what Marlena was stressing about the importance of centering Haiti. And I think that there's something so rich about thinking about what we learn from an Atlantic context about the stakes of centuries of Atlantic slavery, like centuries of the chattel principle, centuries of colonialism, and what that does to and how like what is possible after that, but also like what is like truly radical in the face of that. And that's what I really like about the work that you're doing here, which is the work that is Haiti's work, is Haitians' work, like the way that we can learn from Haiti, not as a symbol, but as self-conscious Black politics, plural, that are emerging in this period, and that us learning that from the Atlantic side, from the pre-1804 side, actually tells us something about really what was at stake in the pre-1804 moment, if that makes sense. So in a lot of ways, like sort of refracting some of the major tensions that you surface, and that so many people here surface, helps us understand what people and communities and what was at stake for Black politics in an earlier moment. Like it's not the two are very much linked, I guess, in some ways. Like it tells us how intense things were. The 18th century was mad intense, and there's like, I feel like there's no, like I have to use slang to actually get at the feeling there. And Haiti is iconic in the way that it helps us refract and see that, but not in a symbolic way. So I don't know, I'm fumbling, but I guess I'm trying to say that there is something really, really important here for those of us who do before the chronology that you're laying out, but we actually really need your text in order for us to really grapple with that before and what is actually at stake in that before. So yeah, so that's less of a question and more of a comment and a thank you for helping to flesh our period out, our 18th century out as well.
Yeah, that's you. But you actually gave words there to something that something that I wrote. So I know I said it. But that this idea of what the stakes are, even in, again, I think this 1804, 1806 period is in itself like crucial. And I think there's like a whole lot more thinking to be done about that. And Julia Gaffield's writing a biography of Dessalines, so look for that. But the stakes, like the stakes were so intense, but also so clearly worked out in these texts and in the way that Dessalinian thought was trying to sort of critique, contest, and create an anti-colonial, anti-slavery, independent state that could both survive, right, be legible, but also like do the things of sort of resisting these massive forces at work of basically liberalism and Enlightenment republicanism, to try and kind of like stake that out, because they knew they saw. I mean, that's what's so crazy for me, is they knew and they saw what it would mean if they did not, right? What that trap was. And that's what's so powerful about looking at the long 19th century and seeing it through. Again, the ability to be able to see this sort of, again, go back into the 18th century is so profound for me. But to see what they knew, when they knew it, how they knew it, and then to see how it gets just completely, not written out, but chewed up and sort of proved to be correct in the long 19th century is like profound and sort of sublime in an intense way.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think we're coming to our natural end at almost at the top of the hour. Thank you, Chelsea, for being so generous with your time and coming and sharing with us your wonderful work, and for answering the questions of our book club audience. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Such wonderful questions. I'm full of joy after this hour and a half. You have given us an enormous gift here. Now I'll pass the mic to Anna so that she can take us into the next episode of Slaveryarchive Book Club.
Thank you so much, Dan. For those who didn't get the book by Chelsea Stieber, Haiti's Paper War, Post-Independence, Writing Civil War and the Making of the Republic, 1804-1954, and it's available at New York University Press website. You can also get the book through Amazon and other online outlets. Thank you so much again, Chelsea, for coming. And for those of you, this is going to be on YouTube. You can share the link. And I invite you to come to the next one, the next Slaveryarchive Book Club session that will be held on April the 7th at 5 p.m. And you are going to discuss the book Force and Freedom by Kelly Carter Jackson, then Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Then go ahead, get the book. This is not a very big book in terms of length. Then you have time to read it until our session. You can get it on the website of Penn University Press, or you can get on Amazon or elsewhere, wherever you prefer. And meet us here. Then Jessica Johnson will be leading the discussion on April the 7th. And again, thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you so much, Alex, for leading this conversation today. And thank you so much, Jessica, our co-host, who will be animating the session of April the 7th. And especially special thanks to Chelsea for this wonderful book, which I hope all of you will read if you didn't yet. And thank you so much to all those of you who came here today to attend this session. And I hope you are going to join us again in the future. Bye-bye, folks.